both of our discussants, I think, have a number of things in common, despite appearances, and that is that they're both exiles. You were born in Iran, Reza, and you came to America after the 1979 revolution. You were born in Uganda and came to Canada, which is not America, I'm told.
Definitely not.
After that, and so you've both grown up in a very secularized and maybe a secular society. I really want to know, to kick us off, how you came to write your books. Your book is really No God But God, which is an exploration of the history of Islam and some of the issues going on today. I mean, what led you to write that book, and why?
Well, there's a couple of things. At the time, I was a professor at the University of Iowa, and actually one of my students is here, Stephanie. Say hi, Stephanie. I'm just proud because one of my students is here from years ago. And I had a course in the Introduction to Islam, and before September 11th, that course had about 34 students in it. And after September 11th, it had 289 students. So I figured that probably people are interested in this topic. But the problem was that so much of the discussion about Islam and the Islamic world was being had almost exclusively on the margins, either by those who were claiming, sort of a certain knowledge about what Islam was, or those who were accepting that interpretation of Islam and then rejecting it in a very public way. And I thought that neither of those two arguments was getting at the core issue within Islam, and that is the fact that this is the most diverse religion in the history of the world. You began by saying, you'd be curious to find out how far or in what ways either Irshad or I represent Islam. Nobody represents Islam. That's the problem. This sheer eclecticism and diversity of this religion makes it impossible to take seriously the arguments of those Puritans, the Wahhabists, the Salafists, the Arabocentric Orthodox version of Islam, which, despite still being quite a minority movement, is still an incredibly loud, very aggressive movement and an evangelizing movement. It's really. We can talk about the Wahhabization of the Muslim world, which is taking place right now. But nevertheless, the principal argument of that being that Islam is this static, archaic, unchanging, an Arab religion is total absurdity. Islam hasn't been an Arab religion for about 1,300 years, and Arabs make up something like 8% of the world's 1.5 billion Muslims. And yet there is a real problem with this Wahhabization, this puritanification of Islam that is being led by the almost bottomless pockets of the Saudi royal family.
And so
my attempt was to write a book that showed the diversity of Islam, the countless ways in which it has been understood throughout history, from the moment in which the Prophet first began to reveal the words of the Quran to this very day and age, in order to show this internal conflict that has been raging within Islam for centuries, but which has over the last century or so really begun to bubble up to the surface, and with cataclysmic results.
Now, what prompted you to write your book?
Well, let me start with a clarification, since I know this is being recorded. What did Matthew mean when he said the last time we saw each other we were sleeping side by side? I need to explain that we were both in a car in Davos, Switzerland, having just finished up our visits to the World Economic Forum, and I needed a ride to the airport. And it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and he very kindly, being the gentleman that he is, agreed to pick me up from my hotel and ferry me and my partner to the airport, and we all slept in the car. Okay.
I thought if I'd said that, it would seem so disappointing.
Well, it's disappointing to those who aren't under a death threat, okay? And like, if this is, if we were going to let this go unclarified, it would just be more fodder for those who, claim that I am something other than I actually am. Having said that, let me also say that in writing a book called The Trouble with Islam and later The Trouble with Islam Today, I am not for a moment denying that there's trouble in the other great religions of the world. The difference is that there are no shortage of books available about the trouble within Christianity, no dearth of books on the shelves and in the stores about the trouble within Judaism. We Muslims, I believe, have a lot of catching up to do in the dissent department. And so while Reza very rightly says that Islam is rich with diversity, I would argue that it's rich with diversity in the shadows, and that is to say today, not historically. And we've got to get many more voices from out of the shadows. And that reality hit home to me, Matthew, after 9/11, when we kept hearing Muslim spokespeople, self-appointed often spokespeople, insist that Islam has been hijacked. Then as now, I reject that metaphor. It suggests that Islam is a plane cruising to some human rights haven. And were it not for those nasty terrorists on September 11, 2001, this plane would have reached its wondrous destination with nary a bump, thank you very much. But we know that's not true. The reality is, and as a journalist, not as an ideologue, as a journalist, I have to pay attention to what's happening on the ground. The reality is that in the last 50 years alone, more Muslims have been maimed and raped and imprisoned and tortured and murdered at the hands of other Muslims and at the hands of any foreign imperial power. And I believe, based on my research, that mainstream Muslims have contributed to that reality through our, or I should say their, I'm hardly mainstream, their complacency, passivity, and denial. They are so quick to point the finger at outside entities, America, Israel, MTV, you name it, fill in the blank, that I think that mainstream Muslims, and not just the Puritans, which are a minority within Islam, have broken faith with that beautiful passage in the Quran, Islam's own scripture, which states that God changes not what is in a people or what is the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves. I wrote this book as an act of restoring faith with that passage.
So do you share the view that, that Islam, at least the Puritan elements within Islam, are actually gaining increasing power over the last 50 years? And
not over the last 50 years, over the last 3 years. I think so much has happened over the last 4 or 5 years, particularly since the launch of this war on terror, that it has in some ways wiped our memories clean. There's no question that the last 50 years has seen an enormous amount of social and political, economic, religious upheaval in certain parts of the Muslim world. To describe that as an Islamic phenomenon, I think, is a little disingenuous. It's no coincidence that these places in which Muslims are killing and raping Muslims happen to be in places where there's a profound lack of social, economic, political development, most often as a result of Muslim leaders, of Muslim political and religious leaders. There is this tendency, I think, in the West especially, to think of the Islamic world as being run by theocrats. There is not a single state in the whole of the Muslim world that is run by religious leaders except for Iran. And Iran is quite a complicated exception. The problem in that region is not theocracy. The problem in that region is autocracy. Now, does that mean that the religious establishment or religious figures, or for that matter, the people at the extremes and the margins in large parts of the Arab and Muslim world do not have too much influence, too much authority, and that they've done very little in promoting the kind of development that region needs? Absolutely, there's no question about it.